They call at 3:47 in the morning. They think their power is a weapon that can freeze my blood. They think their ultimatums are laws we must obey. They see our land.
The red phone in the presidential palace of Ouagadougou had never rung at 3:47 a.m. with such ominous persistence. Its shrill, mechanical scream was a foreign sound in the pre-dawn quiet, a sound that did not belong to the gentle hum of insects or the distant, mournful call of a night bird. It was the sound of the outside world intruding with violent urgency. Ibrahim Traoré, still wearing his military fatigues from the late strategy meeting, felt his blood freeze as he recognized the Moscow area code blinking on the caller ID. The weight of 27 years pressed against his shoulders, a physical sensation that made the simple act of lifting the receiver feel like raising a slab of stone. He knew, with a certainty that chilled his bones, that powerful men only called at such hours when the world was about to shift on its axis. His aide, Captain Sankara, stood motionless by the door, a silhouette against the dimly lit corridor. He did not need to hear the words. He read the gravity of the moment in the subtle tightening of his president's jaw, in the way his shoulders squared as if bracing for a physical blow. The humid African night air, thick with the scent of dust, and blooming frangipani seemed to hold its breath. Beyond the palace walls, the city slept, its rhythms undisturbed. The guards patrolled their routes with vigilant boredom, their boots crunching softly on gravel, unaware that history, cold and demanding, was calling on a secure line from 7,000 kilometers away. Captain Traoré. The voice that came down the line was not a greeting. It was a statement of fact, cold, calculated, and stripped of all diplomatic pretense. It was a voice that had negotiated with world leaders and commanded armies across continents, a voice that carried the weight of nuclear arsenals and the glacial patience of a man who had never been told no by smaller nations. Vladimir Putin's tone cut through the international line with surgical precision, each syllable designed to remind the young African leader of the vast, unbridgeable power differential between their nations. There was no translator. The Russian leader spoke in French, his accent harsh and guttural, making the language of the former colonizer sound like a new kind of threat. Ibrahim's grip tightened on the phone, the polished plastic growing warm and slick in his palm. He heard the undertones of expectation, the unshakable assumption that compliance was not a question to be debated, but a formality to be acknowledged. This was not a discussion between peers, it was a summons from a superior. The young president's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat of adrenaline and defiance. But his voice, when he finally spoke, remained steady. A skill learned not in air-conditioned boardrooms, but in the trenches of revolution and the dusty streets. Of a people's uprising, your recent actions in the Sahel have attracted attention in Moscow, Putin continued, his voice carrying the subtle menace of a man accustomed to reshaping global chessboards with a single phone call. He did not elaborate on which actions. He didn't need to. The message was clear. We are watching. We see your every move. The mention of uranium deposits, military partnerships, and regional stability flowed from him like a well-rehearsed script, a litany of geopolitical concerns designed to overwhelm and intimidate. He spoke of Burkina Faso's resources as if they were abstract figures on a balance sheet, their value measured in rubles and strategic advantage, not in the sweat and toil of the Burkinabe people who lived above them. Ibrahim could hear the implied threats beneath each carefully chosen diplomatic phrase. The suggestion that Burkina Faso's newfound independence, hard-won and fiercely guarded, was merely tolerated by the great powers rather than respected. The Russian leader's words painted a vivid picture of consequences that extended far beyond national borders. Economic isolation that would strangle their fledgling economy, military pressure that would test their resolve, and political maneuvering that would turn their neighbors against them. It was a masterclass in coercion, delivered in the dead of night to a man who represented a nation Putin clearly viewed as a pawn. Captain Sankara watched from the doorway as his president's jaw tightened, the muscle flickering beneath his skin. He recognized the signs of a man being pushed toward an impossible corner where every potential path forward was mined with disaster. The weight of 20 million Burkina Faso citizens, their hopes, their struggles, their fragile dreams seemed to materialize in that modest presidential office, pressing down on the solitary figure at the desk. Putin's final words hung in the air like a blade suspended over the continent, sharp and final. "You have 48 hours to reconsider your position, Captain. The world is watching, and Moscow expects cooperation." The line went dead with a soft, definitive click before Ibrahim could form a response. There was no farewell, no opportunity for negotiation. The ultimatum had been delivered. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the mechanical hum of the international telecommunications system and the sound of Ibrahim's own controlled, measured breathing. He slowly placed the receiver back in its cradle, the action feeling monumental. He sat in the darkness of his office, surrounded by the portraits of Thomas Sankara and other African liberation heroes who had faced similar moments of truth. Their eyes, frozen in time, seemed to gaze down at him, their silent stares heavy with expectation and grim warning. Captain Sankara stepped forward, his own breath held, reading the seismic shift in his leader's demeanor. He understood with a clarity that was both terrifying and exhilarating that the next 48 hours would define not just Burkina Faso's future, but perhaps the entire relationship between Africa and the global superpowers for a generation to come. Theme: weight of ancestral expectations and continental dreams pressed against the walls of that small office in Ouagadougou. In the span of a 5-minute phone call, Ibrahim Traoré had been transformed. He was no longer just a military captain who had seized power in a popular revolution. He was now the vessel, the voice that would have to speak for African dignity on the world stage, and his words would echo across every capital on the continent. The first light of dawn began to bleed into the sky, a pale orange streak against the deep indigo. The call to prayer echoed across Ouagadougou, a beautiful, melancholic sound that rolled over the waking city. Ibrahim stood on the palace balcony, watching his nation stir to life. Below, the city was a tapestry of resilience. Vendors arranged, their wares on frayed blankets, second-hand clothes, locally grown vegetables, simple crafts. Children in crisp, if faded uniforms walked in groups toward schools that his government had promised to rebuild and strengthen. The morning light revealed the stark reality of a country still bearing the deep scars of colonial exploitation and decades of corrupt, self-serving leadership. It was a nation of immense potential, perpetually on the cusp of greatness, yet held back by the long shadow of external interference and internal betrayal. His personal phone, a simple smartphone, buzzed constantly on the wrought iron balustrade. The screen lit up with a cascade of messages from fellow African presidents. Some offered support and solidarity, their words cautious but encouraging. Others sought reassurance, their own anxieties laid bare. "What will you do, Ibrahim? Your decision will affect us all." The Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS, that often fractious body, had grown visibly restless overnight. Diplomatic channels, which usually hummed with polite formalities, were now electric with tension. Whispers of emergency summits and, more darkly, of another potential military intervention sanctioned by regional bodies influenced by foreign powers circulated through back channels. Ibrahim knew with a sinking certainty that his response to Moscow would not be contained within the borders of Burkina Faso. It would send seismic ripples across every capital from Dakar to Dar es Salaam, from Nairobi to Johannesburg. He was standing at the epicenter of a continental fault line. "Captain," Sankara entered the office, his arms laden with intelligence briefings that had been compiled through the night. The documents painted a complex and alarming picture of continental politics. "Mr. President," Sankara began, his voice low, "the French military bases across the Sahel, in Niger and Chad, have increased their activity overnight. Unusual. Troop movements, aircraft sorties. They are testing our perimeter, watching our reaction." American diplomatic channels, he reported, were also buzzing, but with a different kind of concern. For Washington, the primary worry was not Burkina Faso, sovereignty, but the expansion of Russian influence in a region they considered within their sphere of interest. Their messages were a mixture of veiled threats and conditional offers of support, all predicated on Burkina Faso aligning with Western interests against Moscow. But the most potent intelligence came from within the continent itself. Reports were flooding in of popular demonstrations in Mali, Niger, and Guinea. In the streets of Bamako and Niamey, citizens were not protesting their own governments, but waving the Burkina Faso flag, the red, green, and yellow, and chanting Ibrahim's name. He had become a symbol, a beacon of true independence in a region weary of puppets and strongmen serving foreign masters. Social media across Africa exploded with hashtags like "A Stand with Traore" and "Odd Africa Dignity," trending in a dozen languages. The digital continent was speaking with one voice, a voice of defiant hope. Pan-African media outlets, which rarely received international attention, found their content shared globally as audiences sought authentic African perspectives on a crisis that Western outlets instinctively framed through Cold War analogies. University students across the continent organized solidarity demonstrations, their chants mixing local languages with English and French demands for genuine independence from all foreign manipulation. The global media frenzy revealed a fundamental disconnect. International powers viewed African sovereignty as a negotiable commodity, while African peoples understood it as the very foundation of their dignity. Social media algorithms, for once, amplified African voices that had long been marginalized in traditional geopolitical discourse, creating a powerful, parallel narrative. By evening, the world was watching. Cable news panels of Africa experts debated Ibrahim's motivations and prospects with a detached analysis that revealed how little they understood the seismic shifts happening on the ground. The international coverage showed how quickly a bilateral dispute could be transformed into a continental symbol. Financial markets in London and New York monitored the situation for potential disruptions to commodity supplies, while diplomatic channels buzzed with concerns about precedent setting that could encourage other resource-rich nations to challenge the established world order. Captain Sankara monitored the global coverage from the Palace Communications Center. The world's attention had transformed their national crisis into a global test case for whether African dignity remained negotiable in the 21st century. Ibrahim Traoré was no longer just responding to Russian pressure. He had become the focal point for a global debate about sovereignty, resource control, and the future of North-South relations. The presidential podium stood beneath Burkina Faso's flag, red for the blood of their revolution, green for its agriculture and abundance, and a central yellow star representing the guiding light of that revolution. International cameras, their lenses long and predatory, focused on the young man who would either validate centuries of foreign assumptions about African weakness or shatter them forever. Ibrahim adjusted the simple microphone. He wore his military uniform, bearing no medals or decorations beyond the simple insignia of his rank and his nation. The assembled press corps from 6 continents leaned forward in anticipation, their questions prepared for what they assumed would be either capitulation, disguised as diplomacy, or defiant rhetoric that would soon be followed by inevitable, quiet compromise. Behind him, the portraits of Thomas Sankara and other liberation heroes seemed to watch, their eyes demanding that their successor answer the fundamental question correctly. Captain Sankara stood rigidly at attention beside the flag. his presence a silent testament to the military backing that had brought Ibrahim to power and would stand behind whatever decision emerged from this historic moment. A profound silence stretched across the main square of Ouagadougou, where tens of thousands had gathered, holding their breath. The only sound was the gentle flutter of the flag in the morning breeze. President Putin, Ibrahim began. His voice was calm, clear, and steady, cutting through the tension like a laser. It did not boom, it did not need to. It carried a quiet authority that silenced the world. He addressed the Russian president directly by name, refusing to hide behind the anonymous shield of the Kremlin or the Russian government. This was personal. The gathered crowd held its breath. International correspondents' fingers hovered over their keyboards. Burkina Faso does not negotiate. Its sovereignty, the simple declarative sentence, landed like a thunderclap. It rippled through the international press corps, through the crowd in the square, and out through television and internet feeds to a watching world. It was a statement of fact that carried revolutionary implications. His voice grew stronger, more resonant, as he continued, each word chosen with precision, each phrase a hammer blow to the foundations of neocolonialism. "We are not your uranium mine." A roar began to build in the square. "We are not your military base." The roar grew louder. "And we are not your client state." The crowd erupted, a wave of sound that washed over the city. Each declaration struck at the very heart of the assumptions that had governed North-South relations for decades. He was giving voice to the unspoken truth that every African knew in their bones. International markets, watching live, immediately reacted. Uranium prices skyrocketed. The final portion of his response transformed from a diplomatic statement into a continental manifesto, his words carrying the accumulated grievances and hopes of generations. For centuries, foreign powers have come to our shores and our lands. They have come with different flags and different languages, but always with the same hunger. They have taken our resources and given us their debts. They have taken our freedom and given us their conditional aid. They have taken our dignity and given us their criticism. That era ends today. He paused, letting the translation catch up, letting the weight of his words sink in across the world. "Africa," he declared, his voice ringing out clear and unwavering, "belongs to Africans." The simple phrase, so obvious, yet so radical in the context of global politics, hung in the air. It was a concept that powerful nations had spent centuries trying to disprove. Our resources are our inheritance, not your entitlement. Our sovereignty is our right, not your concession. Our future will be written by our hands, not dictated by your demands. He looked directly into the cameras, his gaze seeming to pierce through the lens and reach every viewer, from the palaces of Europe to the villages of the Sahel. "To the people of Africa," he said, his tone shifting to one of fierce solidarity, "I say this: our dignity is not for sale. Our freedom is not negotiable. The time for looking outward for permission is over. The time for building our own destiny together has begun." He then returned his gaze to the implied audience in Moscow, and to any power, east or west, north or south, that believes it can threaten our sovereignty, that believes it can issue ultimatums to a free people. You will discover that this generation of African leaders chooses dignity over survival. We would rather stand in poverty than kneel in wealth. We would rather face the unknown future as free men and women than live in the comfortable chains of a dictated present. He took a final breath, the entire world hanging on his next words. The answer is no. The silence that followed was absolute for a single, breathtaking second. Then the city of Ouagadougou exploded in a cacophony of joy, defiance, and pride. The sound was deafening, a physical force of liberation. Ibrahim Traoré did not smile. He simply nodded, turned, and walked away from the podium, leaving his words to echo across the continent and throughout the world. He had not just answered a Russian ultimatum. He had issued a declaration of independence for the entire African continent. The immediate aftermath was chaos of the most historic kind. Shockwaves radiated out from Ouagadougou at the speed of light. Moscow's response was swift and furious, a freezing of assets, the expulsion of diplomats, and a series of ominous statements about safeguarding strategic interests in the region. But something was different. The usual playbook of regime change seemed to falter. The overwhelming, visible, and vocal popular support for Traoré across Africa made the cost of direct intervention prohibitively high. French military bases went on high alert, but Paris found itself in a diplomatic bind. How could it openly oppose a leader championing sovereignty without revealing its own neocolonial instincts? Washington was equally conflicted, torn between its desire to counter Russian influence and its unease with an African leader who defied all external pressure. Not just Moscow's Chinese officials, ever pragmatic, saw an opportunity. They quietly increased trade overtures, offering to buy Burkina Faso's resources at market prices, without the political strings attached by the West or the strong-arm tactics of Russia. They positioned themselves as the respectful, transactional alternative. But the most significant impact was felt within Africa itself. Ibrahim's words were a spark that lit a prairie fire. Within days, massive protests erupted not against their own governments, but in solidarity with Burkina Faso. In Mali, Niger, Guinea, and beyond, citizens demanded their own leaders show similar courage. The African Union, often criticized as a talking shop, found itself forced to address the fundamental question of continental independence head-on. Younger member states demanded a collective, assertive position against all foreign military bases and unfair resource extraction contracts. Ibrahim's Defiance had catalyzed a generational shift. It transformed abstract concepts of sovereignty into concrete, popular demands for dignity and respect. Social media campaigns amplified intellectual and cultural exchanges that bypassed traditional Western institutions, creating new networks of Pan-African thought. The international community's attempts to isolate Burkina Faso backfired spectacularly. The sanctions meant to pressure Ibrahim's government only strengthened his popular support, painting him as a martyr who was suffering for their dignity. Alternative South-South partnerships emerged, creating new possibilities for resource-rich African nations to finally control their own development trajectories. 6 months after the ultimatum, Burkina Faso had not just survived. It had thrived as a symbol of African possibility. It had proven that authentic leadership, backed by popular will, could withstand immense international pressure. Young Africans began looking to Ouagadougou, not Paris, London, or Moscow, for inspiration. Ibrahim's government became a laboratory for 21st century African independence, exploring new models of development that prioritized internal capacity and mutual cooperation over external dependency. The dreams of Sankara, Lumumba, and Nkrumah, once considered tragic and lost, were now seen as alive and achievable. Ibrahim Traoré's fearless response to Putin's ultimatum had proven once and for all that African dignity is indeed non-negotiable in the 21st century. His words didn't just answer Russian pressure, they ignited a continental awakening that continues to reshape global power dynamics to this day. He had chosen dignity, and in doing so, he had given an entire continent permission to do the same. Hey, I said you generate this script to about 13,000 words.